Tēnā tātou I te whānau, me mihi konu kia koe, noho nei koe ki tō kāinga. Kau tēnei Tony Hoimana e potake. Ngā kōrero nui e pāna ki ngā take o te wā nei, me whiti atu ki poi hākena. E kōrero ki etahi o ngā tangata rongo nui no te First Nations o Kena Mula. Me mihi konu kia koe, Jackie. Hey, Jackie, thank you for joining us today. We're talking about the referendum. On the 14th of October, voters in Australia have their say in a referendum about whether to change the constitution to recognise First Peoples of Australia by establishing a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Voice. It seems like there's been some consideration towards the people who belong to the sacred land of Australia. What do you think?
I think, well, firstly, I'd like to start with acknowledging the First Nations people's country I'm on here, which is the Darug Nation in Western Sydney. I think with the adding of the Constitution, I don't know if it's a consideration or if there's a process that's going to happen that will end up causing us more harm in the long run. I believe that this might be what they're referring to as a Trojan horse.
The Constitution does have no actual reference to the Indigenous people of Australia. Will this be an attempt to actually include them as part of the legislation?
So we used to be part of a referendum before 1967. We were already in the Constitution, and then there was a referendum to remove us from the Constitution. Now there's a referendum to add us to the Constitution. So there's already a history there, a long history about constitutional rights versus sovereignty versus a treaty, because in Australia we don't have a treaty, we don't have any sovereign processes, and we are not recognised in the Constitution as First Nations. So currently as we stand, there's no acknowledgement really of First Nations people. But once we go into the Constitution, it possibly could then mean that we'll never get a treaty, and it definitely means that we will never be classed as sovereign people.
So what is the voice of the Indigenous people, the iwi takitaki of Australia, saying? What is their voice? Has there been a process of consultation? Has there been kōrero or leading up to this?
So the way this come about originally was from the Uluru Statement, which was 250 Aboriginal people from various remote communities around Australia coming together and talking about what they are now calling a voice to Parliament. But a lot of people weren't consulted. So in Australia there's over 500 sub-nations, nations and sub-nations, and a lot of people in that room were from selected nations around Australia. They weren't, not everyone was included. So a lot of the people that were involved in the Uluru Statement, they were internally during the whole process, and there were a lot of people left out of that. So they actually don't know how it went about, how it come about, and I guess there's nervousness around only 250 Aboriginal people speaking for the whole Aboriginal nations.
Many of our First Nation people actually are opposing the legislation and want to push for a treaty or series of treaty instead.
Yeah, or sovereign lands. There's a lot of people in the no camp, and the way it stands at the moment, it doesn't look like the referendum's going to be successful in the yes vote. And there's a lot of people who are concerned. We've had 230 plus years here in Australia where the government haven't done the right thing by Aboriginal people, and there's so many First Nations people here that can't trust they're doing the right thing. When you look at what they want to add to the Constitution, it's about creating an advisory committee, and they're using terms like the Australian government may take the advice of, so they're not specifically writing wording that says this advisory committee is going to have any weight. And that's one of the biggest concerns, because it's not clear that the advisory committee will be able to do anything except for say to the government, this is what we recommend. Then the government may or may not take that on board as part of the process.
And how will the advisory committee be made up?
That's the other thing. No one knows. They haven't really been clear about how the advisory committee will be made up. So there's a big concern across definitely here in Western Sydney, but in parts of Queensland, from people that I'm connected to there, that land councils will be who they go to for the advisory committee. And unfortunately, land councils don't have genuine First Nations people's best interests at heart. So there's been some practices that have happened internally around land councils and community that haven't shown good faith for First Nations people either.
We've got a treaty here in Aotearoa, and of course that's a legal binding document. There was a time when the government didn't recognise our treaty, but over the years, the international law through Privy Council and a whole lot of international forums as well has forced our government to actually recognise, number one, us as the First Nations people.
Yeah, I think if we could come to some sort of nationwide agreement around a treaty even would be better than going into the Constitution. It just gives us a little bit more weight and more rights for our own processes.
What about representation in Parliament? I was online and they said that although there are people from the First Nations in the Parliament, they actually haven't been elected as representatives of First Nations people.
Yeah, that's correct too. So the people currently, there's 11 seats in Parliament right now that are filled with Aboriginal people. They're not elected directly by the Aboriginal community, but them 11 seats aren't secure either. They could be taken over by a non-Indigenous person at any time. You know, we don't have 11 allocated seats, and I think that's one of the things that I struggle with the wording, because they're saying a voice to Parliament, where I think it would have a lot more weight if they were saying a voice in Parliament and they allocated us seats that we could be in Parliament. I can't see the voice making a difference in that for Australian people. I just can't see how the voice is going to reduce that inequity that continues to happen and the injustices. There's a lot of non-education that happens in Australia for people that come from around other places. So when they come into Australia, they don't understand the history of what Aboriginal people have done to get to where we are and what we've had to endure. And when they, and when they do learn about it, then they're more likely to stand alongside as allies. But because it's not very well spoken about, they fall into the category that, it's like the category of the Western version of Aboriginal people, which is that we just want more all the time. We're always trying. That's here in Australia. But I guess for future direction, I just want to make sure that my grandbabies and the community that I'm connected to, and then extend that Australia-wide, can still maintain cultural knowledge, support, be able to walk into any place and know that this is First Nations land, and just know that they belong here.
Yeah. Hey, what would you like to share with us for the last words of this special interview?
I'd just like to say thank you for allowing me to come on and spending time with Selena and yourself. If people just want to educate themselves around the voice and make a decision whether they think it's good or not take my word or my stance, and support anyone who's trying to find information.